So good morning again, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning and welcome to this second panel discussion on the EU-Japan Strategic Partnership Agreement. But first and foremost, let me say thank you to the Elcano Royal Institute for giving me this opportunity to chair this panel, and specifically to Mario. Thank you very much for organizing so well this session. After the stimulating presentation we had before on the implication of the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, let's move on now to the Strategic Partnership Agreement that will strengthen the overall partnership within the European Union and Japan by promoting political and sectoral cooperation and joint actions in more than 40 areas of common interest. The agreement will facilitate the joint European Union-Japan efforts to promote shared values such as human rights and rule of law, a rules-based international system, and peace and stability across the world. It will allow as well EU-Japan security cooperation to reach its full potential, taking into account the changes the partners have made in recent years in this field and the current instability in the international order. More generally, through the Strategic Partnership Agreement and along with the Economic Partnership Agreement, the two partners would take on a leadership role in terms of stability and produce effective added value to the partnership. To illustrate us on these issues, we have today the privilege of the presence of our four panelists. Mr. Ken Hashiba, let me have a look on the from the University of Tokyo. He speaks wonderful Spanish, by the way.
No, wonderful. No, wonderful.
He worked in Latin America and Caribbean Bureau, including Japanese Embassy in Mexico. Mario Esteban, you don't need any presentation, but anyway, for those who haven't met him before, he is a senior analyst at the Elcano Royal Institute and senior lecturer at the Center for East Asian Studies of the Autonomous University of Madrid. We have as well Alice Eggman, on my right. She's head of China research at the French Institute for International Relations, Center for Asian Studies. She is also an associate professor at Science in Paris. She specializes in China's domestic and foreign policy, Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula. Her research interests also include global governance, forum diplomacy, and the evolution of think tanks. She is fluent in Mandarin Chinese and regularly undertakes research fieldwork in China and East Asia and exchange with a diversity of regional actors. And finally, last and not least, Professor Axel Berkowski. He's a professor at the University of Pavia in Italy, and he's a senior associate research fellow at the Milan-based Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Professor Berkowski is also executive committee board member at the Stockholm-based European-Japan Advanced Research Network, and he is half English and half German. So, thank you. Okay. I am sure, ladies and gentlemen, that the items we are going to, or that are going to be covered by our four speakers will be of much interest. If I may, I would ask you all to stick to the time frame assigned, so we will have time enough to exchange question and answer period away. And just to be honest with you, I have to inform that I carry with me my weapons of yellow and red card just in case it's needed. Okay? So may I now invite our first speaker, Mr. Ken Hashiba, to take the floor. Mr. Hashiba will elaborate and present the Japan Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative. Mr. Hashiba, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, I would like to say thank you very much for this invitation to the seminar. And as it's introduced, I studied Spanish language in Zaragoza. And it is a great pleasure and honor to participate in this seminar. And I am speaking first Japanese Free and Open Indo-Pacific FOIP initiative, and later I will touch upon a little bit Japan-EU Strategic Partnership Agreement, SPA. Okay. And the rule-based order, it's about the rule-based order. I think that Europe is historically the world pioneer. And Spain, as maritime nation, has a global vision, including Asia. And Japan also is a maritime nation and has a world #6 largest exclusive economic zone. And we have received many things from the sea, like navigation and fishery. And traditionally, Indian Ocean as sea lane or oil road, it is very important, the safety and security. And Japanese initiative FOIP was announced by Prime Minister Abe in the year 2016 August. And later, I think that it gave an impact to the US FOIP strategy. And main element of FOIP is to promote and establish the rule-based order, such as rule of law, freedom of navigation, and free trade. Other pillar is to improve the connectivity in the region. From that point of view, the quality infrastructure is important. And maritime security or maritime law enforcement is important, and Japan put importance on the capacity building and humanitarian assistance, and natural disaster prevention is also important. There was some opinion that this Japanese initiative FOIP is a countermeasure to China. I cannot deny here 100% this opinion, but I think rather than that, Japan focus on the future potential to this region, India, ASEAN, Middle East, and Africa. And Japan can cooperate or collaborate with every country if they are satisfied with international standard like openness, transparency, economic efficiency, and debt sustainability. And Japan has no intention to create or establish any new international organization or institution. Japan would like to FOIP to be a foundation for peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. About the rule-based order, Japan, as promoter of FOIP, and EU are very important partners. SPA was signed last year, July, and in the current situation that US government or President Trump is unpredictable, and they are insisting America first more than the international rule. From that point of view, this SPA is significant against the protectionism. And I would like to read one important phrase in the SPA itself. EU and Japan, right? Reaffirming their commitment to the common values and principles, in particular, democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms, which constitute the basis for their deep and long-lasting cooperation as strategic partners. I hope that this SPA will enter into force as soon as possible. And finally, I just would like to have a brief comment about EU-Japan EPA. As the previous session is discussed, this agreement entered into force this month, the first day of February. And on that day, I saw many news, especially TV news, about this point. But they focused on the European wine and cheese, and this is just one part, but I think that it is an evidence that the Japanese people welcome the partnership with European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kashiba. I didn't expect less than you, 7 minutes. So thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Mr. Esteban, and he will focus on the strategic partnership agreement potential implications on the EU and Japan relationships. Mr. Esteban, we are delighted to listen to you.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and also thank you for all the team, for Elcano Real Institute, for organizing this, because although my mention was mentioned before, this is obviously, a collective effort, because otherwise this wouldn't be possible. We are supposed to speak from 7 to 10 minutes, okay? So please don't throw anything if I speak for more than 7 minutes, but I promise I wouldn't speak for more than 10. My presentation will be divided into 4 different sections. First, I would like to talk about the rationale behind the SPA, the Strategic Partnership Agreement. Then I will make a very brief overview and assessment of the SPA. Third, I will talk about what's next. What can we expect, right after the SPA, will be entering into force. And finally, sorry, I will talk about difficulties. It's always, I think it's always needed to talk about the difficulties that lie ahead for deepening the strategic cooperation between the EU and Japan. Okay, so beginning with the rationale, the motivation behind the Strategic Partnership Agreement. As you all know, there is a very strong normative consensus, behind this SPA. But this normative consensus was there for quite a long time. This is not new that Japan and the EU, we share all that kind of values, democracy, human rights, rule of law, and so on. This is not new. So what's new? What's the reason that finally, we've been engaging each other and being able, to agree to establish this kind of a strategic partnership? This has a lot to do with the current international context. This is not by chance that in the last few years, Japan and the EU and some member states have strengthened their strategic cooperation, I mean, it's very obvious with France, the UK, you know. Also was mentioned before that Spain and Japan also established this strategic partnership, you know, in October last year. And the reason behind all of these developments and the reasons behind this SPA, from my point of view, I think they are quite obvious, and have to do with the challenges that the current open and rule-based international order is facing. And I think we can talk about like a three-pronged challenge. I mean, there are like three sources from challenges to this order. One, there are countries, you know, like mainly, we always talk mainly about Russia, you know, and China, countries that, well, they are more confident now to vulnerate international law and follow unilateral approaches, even when involve territorial conflicts. You know, I mean, we know very clearly in Europe, you know, also in the South China Sea, we are very aware of that. That's one of the clear challenges we are facing, both Japan and Europe in our neighborhood. Second, I think it's related, second challenge comes unexpectedly from the US. You know, I think it's unexpectedly it comes from the US. It was mentioned before, you know, that the current American administration has shown very clear disregard from multilateralism in key areas for us, like free trade, like climate change. So, you know, we need to move together and do something about that. And also, the problem is related with the traditional alliances on the defensive side. The US also, the current President Donald Trump has made some worrisome comments, you know, regarding NATO, regarding strategic alliances. So Japan and the US, Japan and the EU, you know, we are looking more to each other in order to fill, to some extent, the gap that the US is leaving on those sides, those two sides. And finally, again, also probably even more unexpectedly, the challenge we are facing from our own societies. And Miguel mentioned that, you know, in the first panel. You know, I won't elaborate more on that because he already covered this idea, you know, but basically, it's very clear in Europe, if the open and liberal international order doesn't provide, you know, improvement in the socioeconomic standards of the people won't be that supportive of that international order, and therefore, you know, that should be problematic if we want to mobilize support from that order inside societies that don't support it anymore. You know, so I think that's the third challenge. And this is the backdrop against the EU and Japan. You know, are like finding together that they are reliable, could be a reliable and useful partner to each other. You know, in order to revitalize this threatened international order. Talking about the overview and brief assessment of this SPA. Well, the SPA is far from perfect. I don't want to elaborate now on that, but let's be clear, it's far from perfect, but it's definitely very good news. I mean, this is very good news, you know, that we have been able to agree, you know, to this SPA, because I think we are sending a clear signal of our joint commitment, you know, to revitalizing, as I mentioned before, this rules-based and open, you know, international order. Also, I think it's very important because we are moving the bilateral relationship far beyond the economic arena. You know, we've been traditionally significant economic partners to each other, and now, you know, we are broadening that the scope of that partnership, you know, so I think that's also a good sign. I think it's very positive. And related also to this, I think it's particularly positive that we are not only moving this partnership beyond the economic dimension, but also covering in this SPA some of the issues that were mentioned before also regarding the socioeconomic welfare. I don't know if you have been if you went through this SPA, you know, but you will see that there are many points there related with things like consumer policy, economic and financial policy, industrial policy, employment and social affairs, taxation, you know. So we are really just covering also this domestic dimension, you know. So I think this is a very well-balanced, you know, effort, you know, a very comprehensive effort in order to tackle those three challenges, you know, that I mentioned before. You know. What's next after the SPA? Well, obviously, we need to give like content. We need to put meat, you know, on those sectorial cooperations because, again, you know, you've seen the SPA. You know, it's just one paragraph, two paragraph, you know, very broad statements. I mean, almost we say nothing there. I mean, I don't want to be go too far, you know, but in some areas we really need, you know, to get into details. You know, I think that would be the next step, you know, to work together as I said, to put some meat, into that different sectorial cooperation. There is not much on defense, the SPA, and it's obvious that we can also, move onto that. And I think another point we should also work together with has to do with rethinking our relationship with China, because traditionally that has been one of the things in which Japan and Europe we've been have more different strategic approach. There are very different perceptions of to what extent China is a threat, for Japan and for the EU. But now the EU, we are reconsidering, our strategic view on China. And I think this is important. I think it's important to do this together with Japan for one reason that, the former speaker mentioned, Professor Hashiba, this idea that what's more important for us? Balance of power, power politics, or the norms and values we want to build upon on this international system. And I think that the approach of Japan and the EU is very similar, because there are other countries, probably in the moment, like China, Russia, the US, I stress that, the US is also there, that they care much more about balance of power in terms of, the procedures, the norms, and the values behind, some international regimes. And I think this is a very important point, together for Japan and the EU. So maybe we need to think through together, some of these relationships. Finally, obstacles for moving forward. I think I have 2 more minutes, right, for the 10 minutes? Good, so
it's okay.
I will fulfill my promise to finish in 10 minutes. Obstacles, for moving forward. Okay, first of all, this is a huge challenge in the fact that, if we want to keep an open and inclusive, a rule-based international order, but we live in an international community in which great powers, like the US, China, and Russia, they prefer, to focus more on balance of power and power politics and relative gains. Good luck to us, in trying to prepare, in that context. And also, I think this is very related to what Miguel said right at the end of the previous panel. When you mentioned these 3 options, and that probably we should not exclude or take one or the other, but try to work, at the same time, on different paths, in order to try to really revitalize the order, and have an inclusive, open, kind of win-win, really win-win, really win-win, kind of international order. Second challenge is, of course, that the EU and Japan, we have different US strategic priorities. We tend to focus much more on our vicinity, and obviously our vicinities are not the same, because we are very far away, from each other. Therefore, there is clearly limited political will, to engage in security issues, in the other's vicinity, and that's an obstacle to keep promoting, keep moving forward in our strategic cooperation. Third point, we have different threat perceptions. Even if I mentioned before that we are rethinking, about China, it's obviously that we have, at the moment, we have different threat perception when it comes to China, when it comes to Russia, Finally, I think there's a fourth limitation, is limited capabilities. I think that's quite obvious, for some, particularly from the European side, and some particular European countries, and after Brexit, this is going to be even more difficult, for us to have not just the political will, but the capabilities, to strengthen this cooperation, So, thank you. That's it from my part. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Esteban. Again, 10 minutes. That's perfect. Thank you very much. Okay. It's a privilege now to have Professor Alice Eggman at this panel. Professor Eggman will offer the different views that China and the European Union have on the Eastern Asia security structure. So we are looking forward to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General, and thank you to Elcano for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here and to practice my Spanish, although I cannot pronounce Zaragoza as well as Ben did, but I will try in the coming days. As a China expert, let me focus on something that has been actually quite unnoticed in Europe and actually under-analyzed also in the US, but may have significant consequences on the balance of power and also on the competition between the Indo-Pacific and something else, which is what China has created since 2013, is China's new security architecture in Asia. It's funny, sometimes, you have concepts that are launched, some are promoted more extensively than others. China has been very successful in promoting the Belt and Road Initiative, at least from a public diplomacy perspective. But so far, this concept of a new security architecture in Asia has remained unnoticed, but it is at the core of China's foreign policy today under Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping mentioned it already in 2013, but the May 2015 white paper on China's military strategy explicitly advocates the promotion promoting the establishment, I quote, of a regional framework for security and cooperation. This call was reaffirmed in October 2016 and detailed further in China's white paper on security cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region, which was published in January 2017. And to the Xiangshan Forum, which is China's regional security forum that has been organized on an annual basis, except last year, but this year again was organized. And Xi Jinping wrote a letter that was read by a representative of the PLA, himself calling, now he reshaped slightly the label, he said, to a new type of security partnership in Asia, and his speech indicated that also beyond Asia. So what I propose to you now is that to explain real briefly what it is, actually, in the first part. Second part, the consequences for the region, and also for what can present it as the free and open Indo-Pacific. And third, I will propose some modest elements of recommendation, if you allow me. So what is this strange animal that remained unnoticed, but China keeps repeating in Security Forum, even at the Munich conference? Yang Jiechi, the counselor said, China supports security dialogue among the Asia-Pacific countries, an effort to promote a regional security vision and architecture that fits the reality of this region. So it was a bit undertone compared to what China actually pronounced domestically, but it's really about the creation of something new, which has 6 characteristics. First characteristic, the security architecture that China proposes is based on non-alliance. We say it's strange to base something on a negative dimension. But actually, it's really strong now. Under Xi Jinping, maybe since Mao, I think China has never been so clear about its rejection of the alliance system. Xi Jinping and Chinese officials explicitly said that actually alliances are inefficient, they are full of obligations. In one country have to support the other in case of crisis, maybe not even if it's not in its interest, etc., etc. It's old-fashioned, it has been created, this is informal communication in Chinese think tank, it has been created by Western powers, and it is time to, well, China has never been supporting the alliance system, but China is now officially and more vocally rejecting it. And it's interesting that it is also basing its bilateral partnership, security partnership with some countries, such as Russia, on this principle. Now, when you read the joint communiqué of Russia and China, they underline the principle of non-alliance. So first characteristic of the security architecture. Second characteristic, as Indo-Pacific, China does not plan to create any new formal institution. Chinese think tanks, they thought about, they considered creating, they looked at what was existing in transatlantic security partnership, what was existing in Europe, the OSCE, and NATO, etc. They said, well, should we create an Asia-based framework that is similar? And the conclusion was no. Actually, it's more efficient to create something informal, evolving. Just also in terms of promotion, it's more efficient, and China should go toward that direction. So more concretely, and this leads to my third point, China is investing massively in existing security framework in the region, such as the SCO, which it has partly created, but also the CICA, this conference involving a significant number of Central Asian countries, but not Japan, not the US, and China has presided for 4 years now. It's still quite inefficient, this framework, but it's one example among others. China has also invested in its relation with ASEAN countries, and in all the ASEAN-affiliated meetings. China also invested in ASEM meeting, and China has also created, as I mentioned, a security forum, such as the Xiangshan Forum, which is trying to upgrade to create alternatives to existing Western security forums, such as the Shangri-La Dialogue. fourth characteristic of China's initiative, it's a strong relation between security governance and economic governance. To give you an example, we can look at the SCO. China sees it, of course, as a security institution, but also officials have called for the creation of a development bank affiliated to this institution. Another example is the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Although China does not officially present it as such, it has security implications, and it will probably have more in the future, and we could elaborate on this in the Q&A. The fifth characteristics of China's initiative, China's new security architecture in Asia, or China's new type of security partnership, as Xi Jinping is actually labeling it today, is that it is open to everyone. Inclusive. Of course, we say, okay, inclusiveness is always a keyword that is included in all, speeches, official speeches from anyone. But interestingly, what does that mean concretely is that allies, US allies, are welcome to join China's new type of security partnership. And the US itself is welcome. I'm very much unlikely to join, but China mentioned this. But it's ironic, as the approach is a bit the same as the BRI, right? Everybody's welcome. But when it comes to security partnership, this question is even more interesting to analyze because the alliance framework architecture is less flexible than what China proposes as a network. So and sorry, I forgot the sixth characteristic. So everybody's welcome. But concretely, of course, not everybody has joined so far, and actually membership is not formal, so it's hard to draw a list of countries who have joined or not, but we can at least identify countries who have supported China's initiative in one way or another. Russia, clearly. And also China has tried to develop security ties with some ASEAN countries, and also China is increasingly trying to reach out to African countries, sub-Saharan African countries in particular. That was particularly clear at the last Yongshan Forum, where China invited to this regional security forum a lot of African countries. So it's a very broad definition of the region. Although China does not talk about Indo-Pacific and does not use this term, of course, but use Asia and just Asia. Consequences. Many, but I will underline three potential consequences of this development. First of all, I foresee a potential competition, and already we can partly notice this, a potential competition between China's initiative, so China's new type of security partnership, and the current alliance system, or more specifically, because also to relate to Ken's orientation, between China's initiative and the Indo-Pacific initiative. We see the forming of two grouping of countries that are referring to different principles, different definition of security, different approach to the UN Security Council, different approach to interference or non-interference or responsibility to protect, etc., etc. Of course, different approach to maritime security. So we could see this competition reinforcing in the coming years as both concepts consolidate, develop, and extend to more countries. Second consequence, I would entitle it blurred lines. Blurred lines. Basically, given that everybody is welcome in China's new type of security partnership, we may see in the future, yes, strong, countries who had so far strong security ties with the US and who are step by step progressively interested in China's call, China's proposal in the field of security. It can be step by step, of course, it can be very long term, but it can be through step by step purchase of China's defense equipment, small size military exercise, joint military exercise, participation to China's security forum, supporting China's security concept, etc., etc. And the third consequence that we could see in the very long term would be, that's related to my second point, the first point, if I made a synthesis of two previous points, is blurred bipolarization, blurred polarization, sorry for my mispronunciation, of the region and the world. And the region is a very interesting laboratory to look at, because you have countries who are trying to position themselves in between China and the US in terms of security partnership. And I don't really see how this can be feasible in the long term. If we consider a reinforcement of the rivalry and the competition between China and the US, the level of tension is extremely high, in my opinion, between China and the US, not just on trade, but also on geostrategic issue, as you know, on the institutional issue, but also on ideological and conceptual issue that we can develop in the Q&A, and this can lead to actual bipolarization. Of course, it will be very long term, and China is fully aware, Chinese officials are fully aware that the US security alliance is very much structuring the Asia-Pacific region, and it would be unrealistic, even if they wished so, to put it into question in the immediate term. It's a step-by-step erosion of a military presence that China considers illegitimate, at least the Communist Party of China, as mentioned in the discussion. So, third part, modest point of recommendation. I would say the first one, I would say it very bluntly, I would say avoid cynicism or avoid looking down at China's initiative. I don't understand why this initiative has remained so much unnoticed so far. I'm not here to promote any Chinese concept, I'm here to analyze them. And I saw in Shangri-La Dialogue or in some key security forum in Asia, some people laughing at Chinese speeches, but they were really exposing this. I mean, at least, and I know based on my research that China has been thinking strategically for years before launching it. So you can launch you can laugh at the launch of the initiative, but I think we should be aware that there is strategic thinking behind it. And this strategic thinking is partly based on the assessment of the weaknesses of the alliance system in Asia-Pacific, on tension that may exist between allies, for example, between Japan and Korea, but also tension now that may exist between members of the Indo-Pacific grouping. For instance, between Japan and India. PLA officials are underlining already the divergences between Japan and India in their approach and perception of the region and their definition of the Indo-Pacific concept. So I would, the first recommendation is at least to take seriously this initiative, considering the potential consequences of it. It might not evolve the way I analyze it in part 2, but it's already launched and based on strategic thinking. Second modest point of recommendation would be maybe on the Indo-Pacific side, on Japan side and member of the Indo-Pacific, clarifying the like-mindedness in the field of security. Because we often talk about like-minded country, okay? I think it's becoming clearer, it's already clear in the economic sphere, but in the security sphere, how are we like-minded? And we can explain that in diversity of field, maritime security, or, freedom of navigation. I think we can also be more specific, but also I'm thinking about the regime change or not, interference, responsibility to protect. These are concepts, for example, China is not comfortable with the concept of responsibility to protect. Is Indo-Pacific comfortable with this term? In the case of regime change, or is there a common position or not, a common approach? Even a conceptual and ideological definition or clarification would be needed, I think, in my opinion. And the third point, which is a point of recommendation to the EU side, which would be to clarify its approach towards the Indo-Pacific strategy itself. It's interesting at this point in time that the EU is not clear about its approach. It's not using the term. EU officials are not using the term. I'm not saying they should. It's just saying that it's normal that we have this question about the EU's position toward the Indo-Pacific concept. France has decided to support the Indo-Pacific concept. Once again, I don't know if it's good or bad. France has its own interests, its own territories in the region, its own strong relationship with India that is consolidated, and Australia, submarines, sale, etc., etc. But at some point, I think the EU cannot continue without clarifying its position on this point, or at least without having an internal discussion among EU member states about their potential, joint position on the Indo-Pacific. And I will stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Ekman. And thank you for sharing with us your expertise in the area that is really key for the global security. So thank you very much again. So it's time now to listen to Mr. Axel Berkowski. He will show us the importance of the infrastructure development and the connectivity in the area as a strategic area of cooperation between the EU and Japan.
Thank you. Thank you, Alfonso. Thank you very much, Alfonso. I will make you use your yellow and red card today, if I may. I'm sure we'll do this. So let's go. Muchas gracias por la invitación a Madrid, Mario. Thank you very much for this. The last time I met Mario was in October in Brussels, and there was a conference with a North Korean delegation, and they were asking me for all my business cards, and I didn't receive any, so I ended up on some list, I think. You know, this is probably a much nicer conference in Japan. So North Korea was good, but this is better. And also missed an opportunity to make some self-advertisement. I've written an article on the SPA. I'm not talking about the SPA today, but I've written an article on the SPA in a dossier which was published by the newspaper La Vanguardia. Okay. And the article is called El Acuerdo Unión Europea-Japón, bueno o non lo suficiente. Okay. This was published in December. And if I had been smart, I would have brought this with me today, but I didn't. So that's my mistake. Japanese quality infrastructure, following up on what Ken was saying earlier in the concept of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific policy and strategy. So the quality infrastructure, and I will explain to you what this is and how the European Union could potentially, also based on what we heard earlier on the EPA and SPA, how the EU could somehow feature in the concept of Japanese quality infrastructure investments in the Indo-Pacific, which the EU, you're right, at least the EU is not really using that term yet, but they're getting used to the term. So, the more when I go to Brussels now, people are, listening, not to me, of course, but to other people, listening more carefully, listen more closely when the term Indo-Pacific comes up, because it is beginning to take shape in Japan. Is of course largely responsible for this in a positive manner, that the Indo-Pacific concept is taking shape. And quality infrastructure development, Japanese style, is very, very important. Okay. Now let's move very quickly, and this is also very quickly because there is not very much yet on how the EU and Japan, based also on the agreement, on the SPA agreement and the EPA agreement, how the EU and Japan could cooperate there. In October 2018, the EU and Japan held their first high-level industrial trade and economic dialogue. Okay, a dialogue, by the way, and Alice knows this, a dialogue the EU has had with China for many years. Okay, so this high-level industrial trade and investment dialogue the EU has now with Japan, in only 2018, the EU has had with China for many, many years. So this is also giving you an impression. You can draw your own conclusions about how important those kind of exchanges have been with Japan until today. This, of course, is bound to change now with the EPA and SPA, we hope. And of course, that's well underway. Also because the EU-China high-level trade and investment dialogue with China has not produced any results. I mean, it has been going on for many years, and it has been a dialogue that has, above all, shown the problems and the difficulties the EU and China have in terms of trade and investment relations. This is different in the case of Japan, certainly. Okay. So the first high-level dialogue took place in October, and there one of the results, or the main result, of that meeting is two memoranda of understanding between the European Investment Bank (EIB) and the Japan Bank for International Cooperation (JBIC). And the second memorandum of understanding, the EIB again, so the European Investment Bank, with the Nippon Export Investment Insurance Group, NEXI. Okay, so this is the first result of how the EU and Japan envision in the future, okay, to cooperate in quality infrastructure in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. So it's a very broadly defined concept of the Indo-Pacific, which goes as far as Africa. And of course, not by coincidence, and of course the Chinese factor, and this has been elaborated on by Alice. The Chinese factor, of course, comes into the equation, and I'll explain a little further on how this is important. Okay, but that's it. That's it. So we have two memoranda of understanding. We have the expression of an intention to cooperate, but we have a long agreement. We have the SPA with 54 articles. We have the EPA. I don't know how many thousands of pages. But implementing this now, the hard part is now implementing this. But again, these two memoranda of understanding, through which they expressed their intention to extend loans. Okay, so this is hardcore loans. This money for infrastructure projects in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa is already something. So it's fairly quick, and I have to say I'm also surprised, positively surprised. The agreement was adopted, the EPA, in July 2018, and already in October 2018, so only a couple of months later, the first real result. But again, the implementation phase, the joint infrastructure projects, of course, have yet to be implemented, of course, but it's very, very early days. What is Japanese quality infrastructure? And here I skipped that part because that has been elaborated on by Ken earlier. It's of course part of Tokyo's free and open Indo-Pacific concept. So quality infrastructure development is the core of the FOIP. It's not only about maritime security or beefing up security ties with Australia, India, the US, in the Quad context and in the security context, but also in the infrastructure context. And now there, of course, players like Australia, India, above all, as a developing country, at least nobody. They also, of course, come very much into the equation. So this is a very important part. Quality infrastructure is a very, very important part of the FOIP, and also a very important part of the overall security architecture the US, Japan, India, and Australia are envisioning for themselves. And Australia, India, and the US a couple of months ago officially started also endorsing the term quality infrastructure, and those countries are also, India in particular, engaged in a number of very concrete, very well-financed infrastructure projects in India and in other countries of South Asia. So this is very important. Now, when you look at the figures, the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, a couple of months ago published a figure which is impressive, saying that developing Asia is in need of roughly $26 trillion in infrastructure development. $26 trillion is more or less twice the size of the US economy. Okay, that's more or less the proportion. And Japan, since 2015, is putting a lot of money where its mouth is. In 2015, Japan announced its partnership for quality infrastructure for Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, putting initially $110 billion for financing the construction of roads, railways, and ports in Asia on the table. That's 2015. So the first step is 2015, May 2015, $110 billion for infrastructure in Asia, quality infrastructure. Okay, and I explained to you why quality and not only infrastructure. Okay, and this is, of course, a reaction, and Alice alluded to this earlier. It's a reaction to the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, the massive infrastructure development projects initiated by China, which are increasingly running into a lot of problems. Debt trap diplomacy, non-sustainability, lots of other problems which were not foreseen only a couple of years ago. But Japan is stepping in. Japan is certainly through its investments and through its investment plans, certainly seeking to make up some ground to regain some economic clout it has lost to China when China announced the BRI or the OBR, when it was called earlier, to counterbalance Chinese projects, Chinese investments in the region. And not only in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality. And here, finally, we come to explaining why quality infrastructure. It is essentially, if you will, and I'm oversimplifying a little bit, the Japanese approach towards infrastructure development is essentially the very opposite of the Chinese approach. Okay, and when I say this, what do I mean, or what does Japan mean? On the occasion of the G7 summit in Japan in 2016, Tokyo announced the 5 principles which are guiding, at least on paper, Japanese quality infrastructure projects. Number 1, ensuring effective governance, reliable operation, economic efficiency. Second, ensuring job creation, capacity building and transfer of expertise and know-how for local communities. Addressing social and environmental impact and consequences. Ensuring alignment with economic and development plans, including aspects of climate change. Number 5, enhancing effective resource mobilization, including through PPP. This is Japan's approach towards quality infrastructure. And the critics would say, and I will include myself into this, and it becomes very, very, very clear when you look a little bit closer at what China is doing and how China is operating in the context of the BRI. It is the very opposite of how China is operating. Okay, so this is very, very obvious. In many cases, okay, so of course it's debatable, but in many cases it's very obvious. Many of the projects are not yet sustainable. China has created a lot of, or has applied a lot of developing countries like Sri Lanka, like Bangladesh, like the Maldives, to accept essentially that trap diplomacy. I don't know. Bangladesh is renting out the rights to use a port in Bangladesh for 99 years. And China, of course, knows, and Bangladesh knows it as well, that Bangladesh is never going to be able to repay the debt, which means that the port is de facto part of Chinese territory. Okay, maybe over simplifying a little bit, but these kind of approaches, these kind of dependencies, these kinds of consequences for the countries China is cooperating with. Japan is. On paper, it remains to be seen whether Japan can always stick to its principles, but on paper, Japan is seeking to avoid all of this, which of course is also the reason why Japan, at least for now, I will come to this a little later if I have some more time, which Japan until today has refused to join Chinese BRI, because Japan is saying that the way the BRI is operating in many parts along the Silk Road, towards from all the way from Asia to Europe, is the very opposite of how we would like our companies and how our contractors to operate in the region. Okay, although there has been some rapprochement between Japan and China in terms of seeking out whether some sort of collaboration, some sort of Japanese contribution to Chinese-led infrastructure projects are possible. But that's not necessary for the time being, because the $110 billion I mentioned 5 minutes ago, or let's say 1 minute ago, are now $200 billion. Okay, 2016, Japan is in essence doubled the amount of money it is planning to invest, or it is already investing in many projects, double the amount to $200 billion, which is still far less than what China has allocated to its own projects, but it's still a lot of money, and it's still a lot of money which has created already, and I'm not going to read everything out to you now, but has created a long list of projects Japan is already financing or co-financing. Co-financing, of course, very important because of the approach to include local partners, to make them economically sustainable, to help diversification of local economies, so on and so forth. The list is very long. I can cite some example. Japan is financing the construction of a port in Mozambique for $300 million. In Mombasa in Kenya, Tokyo is funding port and related infrastructure worth $300 million also. In Madagascar, in Tomazina, I have no idea where that is, but I've just read it now. Tokyo is funding, it doesn't really matter, Tokyo is funding a port at the tune of $400 million again. Mumbai, India, I know where that is, it's in India. Tokyo is funding a trans-harbor link worth $2.2 billion, a lot of money. He's looking at me already. Yeah, I'm not done yet. No. Okay. Yangon in Myanmar, Japan is funding a container terminal, $200 million. Dawai, again in Myanmar, a port and special economic zone projects at the tune of $800 million, so on and so forth. So the list of the projects Japan is already actively financing without having to consider making contributions to Chinese BRI is very, very long. Okay, and I will elaborate more on this when I write that publication or that paper for your publication. So the list is very long. It's in Africa. It's in Southeast Asia. It's in South Asia, and of course, it is a counter-reaction to Chinese economic penetration. Terrible word in many of these areas. Japan is catching up very, very quickly. Now, with China, and there I get to the end, is that initially said that so far Japan has categorically excluded collaborating to BRI projects because of the concerns I mentioned earlier. But there is some rapprochement. Japan has last year, I think in July, 2017 already, so more than a year ago, has announced that it would, in principle, Japanese contractors, Japanese trading companies would in principle be able and willing to contribute to Chinese-led infrastructure projects if the criteria of openness, transparency, economic sustainability, and other criteria are being fulfilled. Of course, you can argue, and a cynical commentator like myself would argue, well, Japan has formulated these conditions knowing that China would not ever accept those preconditions. And so it happened, of course. China was saying, look, thank you very much for your offer to offer yourself to contribute to our projects, but these criteria are not applicable, at least, the way you formulate them are not applicable in our context. So, Japan certainly knew, and the MITI and the finance ministry certainly knew. Of course, they would argue to the contrary, but they certainly knew that they were offering preconditions to China which China would never accept. Okay, so and of course, it's not Japan's problem. It's Japan sticking to its guns, sticking to its principles, if you will. Right? Okay, so here we go. This is the principal part of Japanese foreign economic policy, and there's nothing wrong with this. India, of course. In October 2018, so a year after Japan was trying to, let's say, softly imposed its preconditions onto China, there has been, some more rapprochement between China and Japan. During Abe's state visit to Beijing in October 2018, Tokyo and Beijing signed a memorandum of understanding, MOU, which foresees the promotion of cooperation aimed at some 50 infrastructure initiatives. So, the plan to cooperate in at least 50 projects is on the table, but again, the implementation phase is in its very early stage, in the sense that it's not taking place yet, because the preconditions Tokyo has set for China are not being met. There might be some flexibility on the Japanese side. I'm sure they are. It's a sort of a negotiation, but for the time being, it's a memorandum of understanding. It's no contract, and it's not written in stone or anything like this. No, 2 more minutes. Is that okay? Yeah. 1
I
more.
don't know. We should ask to the audience.
Yeah, no, sure. They really I think they really like what I'm saying, so I continue. No, finally, sorry. No, finally, the most important player, if you leave Australia and the US aside, Australia very far away geographically, the US ideologically and mentally also very far away from Japan for the time being. So, which leave us with India. And again, what I said earlier, the level of cooperation and the level of envisioned projects with India, not only in quality infrastructure, but also in defense, right? Also in defense, in the area of defense, Alfonso knows something about this, is very, very significant. And this, of course, is also a reaction to Chinese, if you will, territorial expansionism in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Certainly, the reason why Japan and India are expanding their quality infrastructure project cooperation together with very concrete defense cooperation is certainly also has been motivated by Chinese territorial expansionism in Southeast Asia and South Asia. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.